Today's daf we're going to be learning is Baba Batra Daf Kaf Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Mindy Salish. Thank you to Hadron for generously welcoming all to learn Talmud from a brilliant Talmud scholar who has made Daf Yomi a highlight to each of my days. Today's daf is sponsored by Daniel and Sarah Borelowitz in honor of the marriage of their daughter, Esty Sturman, to Jason Ass, nephew of Tina Lamb, fellow Dafaret. A big mazal tov wishing Esty and Jason mazal and bracha ad mea ve'esrim. And today's daf is sponsored in memory of Dr. Alana Hefter Feuerstein, who passed away this week. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. We're going to review a bit of yesterday's daf. What we saw yesterday was we had a Mishnah, then we kind of left the Mishnah. We went to Rabbi Chanina's statement that Rov and Karov holchim achar Rov, and that's going to be what we're going to be dealing with until we get to the next Mishnah on Amud Bet. Just this statement of Rabbi Chanina that when we have to determine, right, do we go by majority or do we go by proximity? We go by majority. Okay, that's his ruling, to which we brought 3 questions. We answered them all, although kind of difficult answers, and we're actually still in the middle of the third. Okay, I say difficult because some of them are a bit of a stretch. Okay, it's not the most convincing answer. Right, like either the Egla Rupa is when it's in between mountains only, right? We seem to think Egla Rupa is anytime it's a body in between 2 cities. We had this Nipul who is within 50 cubits, right? And then we had to say, well, it's midadet, right? It can't fly yet. And that's why we assume it can't go farther than 50. And that's why it can't be from anywhere else. I mean, maybe that's not so far-fetched, but wasn't really the simple reading of the Mishnah. And then we got to the third source, right? After we kicked Rabbi Yirmiyah out of the Beit Midrash. Now we get to the third source, which is, well, we'll just review from there. Tashma, 4 lines from the bottom of Kaf Gimel, Mr. Gemara. Nimtza ben shnei shavachot karov lezeh shelo, karov lezeh shelo. If you find this this chick, this dove chick in between 2 dovecotes, then we go by karov, to which they say, right, when maybe one's bigger than the other, to which we say, no, they're the exact same size. That's where we get a little, right, who's to say every shavach is the exact same size, although theoretically you could say there were standard sizes possibly, but not so likely. But what, maybe this chick could have come from somewhere else. Now, in order to say this, after the way we answered the previous one, we said, what do you mean? They only hop up to 50 cubits, so it can't be that we're worried about coming from anywhere else. So Rashi says here, since we're worried maybe it can come from anywhere, then basically anyone can come take it. And they say here, Rashi says, I'm in the last Rashi on yesterday's daf, that we could be referring to even if it's between 2 dovecotes, even outside a range of 50 cubits. Then, now, if it's outside 50 cubits, then what do we say? We assume it didn't come from here because they can't hop more than 50 cubits. So it's very tricky why they're asking about this. So they're saying we are assuming we're talking about outside of 50 cubits, but still because between these 2, we're going to go and give it to the one it's closest to, which again begs the question, what happened to Rov? If it's beyond 50 cubits, then it should go by somewhere outside. And then basically we should just assume anyone can pick it up. To which they answer, we find a case where even though a chick can only hop within 50 cubits, we can still assume it came from one of these. And why is that? Now we had this on yesterday's daf. We assume that in a shvil of kramim, the dove can fly much farther. The assumption is if it's a path of vineyards, then the chick can even hop farther. And now the question is going to be, if it can even hop farther, then we already think more likely it could belong to one of these 2 shavachim, and it's not just hefker ownerless because we have no idea because we're going to go by Rov, and Rov could be anyone in the world, and then we're going to do that. But we're going to say it's not because it's a Rov issue. The Rov issue is irrelevant, and it's not because we don't hold like Rabbi Chanina and we go by proximity. But it's like this. In ita de me'alma'atu, if you're going to say, and again, Rashi explains here, Sha'al yidei kramim nadida chutz l'chamishim ama, Rashi says, we're talking, this is outside the 50 amma range, but it still could have come from one of the other, one of these 2 dovecotes that we had, because even though it went out of the 50 amma range, it was in a vineyard, and there really they could hop farther. Now, what's the rule of chicks? How far will they hop? We're going to learn all sorts of things that the rabbis believed about chicks. I don't know if it's true or not. But if they came from somewhere else, kevan de midade lo mate atu, because they're hopping, there's no way they came from somewhere else. Why not? We're already beyond 50 cubits. The rules about hopping, besides that we made this rule that they're not going to hop more than 50 cubits, the second, unless they're in the Shvil of Kramim, the second rule is they're only going to hop as far as they can still see their dovecote. They're not going to go that far. It's like kids, they might wander off, but they're always going to make sure they see one of their parents, right? They'll wander. Usually, you do have kids who wander and just get lost, but most kids will wander at a range where they still see their parents. The chicks will wander only as far as they can still see their dovecote. And now we're going to assume that the dovecotes, right, there's this path of vineyards. There's one dovecote on one side, one on the other. We're going to go by whichever it's closest to because there are no other dovecotes in eyesight, right? And therefore, the chick must have come from one of these two, and that we know from determining the patterns of behavior of the dove chicks. Oh, so 3 difficulties were raised against Rabbi Hanina. All 3 were resolved, perhaps in a bit of a stretch kind of way, but that's the way it works in the Gemara. As long as you can resolve it in some way, it's okay. Now we have a few more things we're going to do. The next one is, Abai is going to try to prove Rabbi Hanina from a Mishnah in Nida. Amar Abai, Af Ananami Tanina. We have a Mishnah that says the exact same thing, or same idea, that if we have Rov and Karov, we're going to go by Rov. Well, here we get blood. Okay, we're in Nida, so we're dealing with Nida blood. Dam shenimtza b'prosdor, sfekotame, shecheskato min hamakol, va'af agav di'ika aliyah demikarva. Let's explain. If you find blood in the cervical canal, okay, we're going to try to identify all these locations they're talking about. Not all of them can be identifiable. We're going to have 3 areas. There's the makor, that's clearly the uterus. Uterine blood is tameh, that's known. We have the prosdor, which is the cervical canal, where presumably the blood is coming from the uterus. That's what we're going to be discussing. But there's also something called the aliyah, which according to a footnote in the Koran, nobody's really sure what this is. It sounds like an upper chamber, but not upper to the uterus, because it's upper. It seems like from the way they're describing the sugya, it seems like it's clear what they're saying is there's the cervical canal. Above that is some chamber where the blood that would come from there is not impure. And then there's the uterus. So the karov is the aliyah. This chamber, that's clear from here. It's closer to the canal. So af agav di'ika aliyah de mikarve, even though this upper chamber is closer, we're going to assume that the blood is impure because we're going to assume it came from the uterus, which is the tameh blood. So that would seem to prove Rabbi Hanina, Rov and Karov, we go by Rov and not proximity. Amale Rava, Rov u'matzoi ka'amarta, you're bringing a case where it's not Rov, it's not majority versus proximity. It's majority and frequent versus proximity. Okay, Rov and matzoi. Now, what's the difference between Rov and matzoi? It's a good question. We'll get there in a minute. But Rov and matzoi, lekalamanda amar. He says there's nobody who thinks that when there's Rov and matzoi, we're going to go by Karov. In other words, there's Rabbi Hanina who says when there's majority and there's proximity, we're going to go by majority. But if there, and theoretically, it seems like people disagree with him. But if you go by majority, if there's majority and frequency on the one hand and proximity on the other, for sure we don't go by Karov. Nobody thinks that. So therefore, this doesn't prove Rabbi Hanina. Now, what does it mean, Rov u'matzoi? Rov is describing quantity, and matzoi is describing frequency. Now, what does that mean here? So the quantity of blood is greater in the uterus, and the frequency of the blood that comes out of a woman is more likely, right, is most frequent from the uterus. Okay, that's a statement. Some people think that it's a bit of a stretch to say there's majority of blood is sitting in the uterus, right? It doesn't exactly sit in the uterus, the blood, and the majority of blood, frequently comes out of the uterus. That's more likely. So what some people explain is that Rov u'matzoi is not 2 different things. It's one thing, and it's saying like a super Rov. Like this is so much more likely that the blood is coming from the uterus because almost all blood comes from the uterus. So therefore, we're going to assume, right? The assumption is other blood would be from, let's say, an injury or something if it's coming from some other source. It'd be like a injury kind of blood, but not uterine blood. So anyway, what they're saying, Rov u'matzoi could possibly be, instead of, let's say, a 51% majority, we're talking about a 99% majority or something like that, or 80%, whatever it is. It's just a much higher majority. And then already when the odds move in that direction, we're going to go by Rov over Karov. So how to understand Rov Matzoi is a bit of a debate here. And now we quote this bright of Rabbi Chia, Ditani Rabbi Chia, Dam nimtza beprosdor, and this shows that we really rule like this. Dam that's in the prosdor, the cervical canal, chayavin alav al biat mikdash v'sorfim alav et hatruma. Okay, in a minute, Rav is going to say we can infer from here three things. Okay, but what he basically says is if we find blood here, and then the woman is now impure, we're going to rule that she's impure, even though there's a bit of a doubt. We don't know where it came from. So much so, we're going to rule that she's impure, that by Torah law, she's ruled as impure. It's not like we have a doubt and maybe by rabbinic law. By Torah law, how do we know? Because if she goes into the temple while she's impure, anyone who goes into the temple impure, right? If it's an accident, let's say they didn't know they were impure, they didn't know it was the temple boundaries and they went into the area that's considered the temple, they have to bring a sacrifice, and a definite sacrifice, not like out of a doubt, maybe, right? Like an Asham Taloi, maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. No, we ruled that this is definitive Tumah. And Sorfim Alavat Truma, another thing that we only do unless we're sure, which is we burn Truma. If she came in contact with Truma and disqualified it, right, made it Tameh, impure, we burn the Truma. We only burn Truma if it's really Tameh. So we see here that we rule very strictly here. We take this very seriously, that it's a definite, like, because most of the, we think it's because of Rov and Matzoi, but in a minute we're going to see the Rava said here, Shema mina midu Rabbi Chia tzla. We can infer three things. Shema mina Rov karov alach achar Rov. Rava says we learn from here, when you have Rov and you have Karov, we go by the Rov, which is what Abaye said before and not what Rava said. So there's a little bit of confusion. We'll come back to this in a minute. Kamar's going to ask that question. Here Rava says we can infer from here Rabbi Chanina's halacha. Because if this woman is treated as impure, it must be because we follow Rov and we don't follow proximity. And he doesn't talk at all about Rov Matzui. So we'll get back to that in a minute. The second thing is Shema mina ruba d'oraita. We learn from here that Rov is a law by Torah law. In other words, Acharei Rabim lahatot is a Torah law. And therefore, when there's a doubt and we follow the majority, it becomes Torah law. And that's why you can bring a sacrifice, if you were to do this. And that's why we burn the truma, because it's a Torah law. Ushma mina ita de Rabbi Zera. This goes back to a famous sugya of the 10 stores. 9 of them are kosher. 1 of them is not kosher. Remember this sugya? So this sugya came up in Ketubot. And it comes up in a bunch of places, but particularly what we're going to talk about now is from Ketubot. And it must be we hold like Rabbi Zera. Now I have to give you some background, which is when you have these 9, when you have a piece of meat in the middle of these stores, 9 are kosher, 1 is not kosher. Okay, there's all different cases here, and whether 9, and now I'm talking about one where the majority are kosher, and there's also Ruba d'Ita come on, later come on. I'm not getting into all these details of whether it's in front of us or whether we just don't know which store. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all those details. But some rabbis, they require that there be 2 rovs. It's not enough that you have rov of these stores. I find a piece of meat in between these 10 stores. I can go by majority, but I need 2 majorities. What does that mean? I need both that all the butcher shops in this area, the majority of them are kosher, and the surrounding cities also have a majority of kosher butchers. If I don't have those 2 majorities, then we can't rule. Even if 9 out of 10 stores are kosher, if the majority of cities around, because maybe someone brought it from a different city and maybe it came from somewhere else. Rabbi Zera says, now in a case where you can't have 2 majorities, because let's say the city doors are locked, in which case there's only 1 majority because you can't take into consideration anything else. And there's only 1 majority, he doesn't have a problem with that. Other rabbis say you need to have 2 majorities. And in this case, you won't be able to have 2 majorities because you can't take into consideration anything else because the doors are locked. And it's just this Medina. And in this Medina, we have 1 majority. So he says, no, even if Daltot Medina Neulot, we have 1 majority here and that's sufficient. We have this majority, 9 out of 10 stores are kosher. We can go by that. From Rabbi Chia, we can see that he paskin like Rabbi Zera. Okay, Rabbi Zera was later than him, but he obviously held this way because, let's talk about the woman. The woman is like doors locked because there's only 1 place the blood's coming from and there's only 1 rov to consider. And that's the majority of the blood is from the uterus. And therefore, we're going to rule that she's impure. So, she's just like doors locked. Because there's only 1 place the blood is coming. There's only 1 area where it's coming from, and there we have to rule rov or karov. but it's not like there's another rove we can factor into the picture. And afilu hachi kazlina bataruba, and even then we follow rove, and we don't require these two majorities. So, okay, that's the three things Rava infers from Rabbi Chia. Now we're back to our question. But didn't he say there's nobody who doesn't agree with Rov and Karov, and this is Rov and Matsui, and this is Rov and Matsui. This is super frequent. And that's why we're going to hold this way. But how can he then infer from Rabbi Chia, who's talking about the exact same case, that Rov and Karov, we follow Rov over proximity? Rava already said this isn't a similar case, and he rejected the whole proof of Abaye from this case. So, Hadrabe Rava Mahi, they say Rava changed his mind and said this isn't Rov and Matsui, this is just a regular Rov case, and we're going to go by Rov of the uterus over the proximity of this Aliyah chamber, and therefore, in the end, it does seem like we can prove, because even Rava changed his mind, and we could prove Rabbi Hanina from this Mishnah. Now, we're going to have three more things we want to deal with Rabbi Hanina before we finish the sugya. One is we're going to take a Mora'itic debate between Rav and Shmuel and suggest that their debate is exactly about whether they hold like Rabbi Hanina or not, whether they hold by Rov or whether they hold by Karov. And then we're going to reject it. And then we're going to bring two cases, one where they ruled like Rabbi Hanina and one where they didn't rule like Rabbi Hanina, and try to prove, oh, look, this proves Rabbi Hanina because they ruled like Rabbi Hanina. And then we're going to reject the comparison. And then we're going to bring another story that seems to say they ruled against Rabbi Hanina, as if to prove we don't know like Rabbi Hanina, and then they reject the comparison as well. Each case is going to be considered a different issue in all three of these things. So one, a Mora'itic debate is based on it. No. One is they ruled like Rabbi Hanina. No, they didn't. And the third is they ruled against Rabbi Hanina, and then we're going to reject it. That's the rest of our sugya. So if we go in terms of summarizing, even though we're not done yet, but we had three sources that tried to go against Rabbi Hanina. We have one which we weren't successful in disproving. We had one that, even though the simple reading of each of them really did go against, then we had one that proved Rabbi Hanina, and that in the end we tried to reject, but seems like we put it back as if this does prove Rabbi Hanina. And now we're going to have three attempts which are going to be totally unconnected in the end, or at least suggested that they're not connected. Itmar. So Itmar is always an intro, or almost always an intro to a Mora'itic debate. Chavit shetzafa b'nahal. We have a barrel of wine that's in a stream, and it's basically floating. We don't know where it came from. We don't know, is it wine from a Gentile, which would be yein nesech and forbidden, or is it kosher wine from a Jew? Amar Rav, nimtzeit keneged ir sheruba Yisrael muteret, keneged ir sheruba nochlim asura. Rav simply says, depends where you found it. You found it in a stream that was in, or a river that was in a mainly Jewish town, then it's permitted. You can assume it comes from a Jew, Rov, Doraita, right? It works. I'm sorry. Well, this is Rov, but not, it's Karov. It's closer to the Jewish city, right? It's in the place where the Jewish city is, so we rule by proximity. If it's Keneged Ir Sheruban Ochrim, if it's a majority of the city is Gentile, then we're going to go by where it's in a Gentile city. We're going to assume it belongs to a Gentile. So that seems to go by Karov and not Rov. You'll see in a minute. Shmuel Amar afilu nimtzeit keneged ir sheruba Yisrael asura. Imor mehai dekira atai. Even if it's in a majority Jewish city, most of the inhabitants are Jewish, it could have come from a bigger city, from Dikra, right? It could have come, right? There's so many options of where it could come from. And the majority of people in the world aren't kosher. And there's a bigger city nearby of Dikra, and therefore it could have come from there. So right now they think that the machloka between them is, do we go by Rov, which is, that's Shmuel, outside the city, right? It's more likely that it came from somewhere else that's bigger. Or do we go by proximity? The city, that's Rav. The city is Jewish. We're going to go by proximity. It obviously came from here. So lema b'de Rabbi Hanina kamiflagei. Demar ilay de Rabbi Hanina. Shmuel holds like Rabbi Hanina. And Mar Rav, who says, no, we're going to go by whatever city it's in, proximity, late to Rabbi Hanina. To which the Gemara says, lo, not at all. De kulei alma iluhu de Rabbi Hanina. And you could claim that everybody thinks we're going to go by Rov, but what? Here it's in a river. Now rivers have unique issues to them, and each one's going to deal with a different unique issue and say, perhaps because of this uniqueness of a river, we're going to rule differently. And the other one's going to say, perhaps the uniqueness of river, we're going to rule the other way. So let's see how they each view it. Demar Saval in Ita Demehai Dekira Atai. If it came, Rav is going to say, it obviously didn't come from the city of Dekira, because if it came from Dekira, which was far away, Ikule Pashure have a mitavale. It would have drowned. Okay, now based on either the currents or the way the water goes, and the Pshure, which is, again, there's different opinions here. Perhaps it's the fasher is when it defrosts, right? So you have glaciers and things that, or the snow from the mountains comes into the river, and on account of some things that happen in the river, it's likely that nothing would really be able to survive a trip of that far without sinking. So therefore, we assume that if it showed up here, it would have to be from nearby, and that's why we follow proximity specifically here. And obviously, Shmuel's going to say the opposite, which is Marsavar. Charifa dinara nakabatai. What do you mean? The river moves very quickly. And we all know that you could drop something in a river and who knows where it's going to wash up, right? So it's more likely in a river that if we're going to go by, some distant place, because it's much more likely it actually came from there rather than from within the city. If it was within the city and the river, probably would have been taken to some other city. So each one, again, the Gemara claims that perhaps this machloket has nothing to do with Rabbi Hanina, has to do with the uniqueness of the river, and then the question is in which way. Next case. So that was a machloket and a moraim that we tried to say is based on this. In the end, wasn't able to be proved. Now we're going to bring two cases. As I said, the first case, each case was a particular case that happened. There was a particular ruling. Question is, does the ruling follow Rabbi Hanina, or does the ruling not follow Rabbi Hanina? And then they're going to reject both attempts to compare and say, again, it was a unique case. They found a barrel of wine that was hidden in someone's pardes. Now, the assumption is, I don't know why exactly this would happen, but someone stole a barrel of wine and hid it in someone else's pardes, now in their vineyard. Sharia Ravina permitted this. He said, we don't have to worry that it was a Gentile who stole it, right? It was in a Jew's field. We don't have to worry that it was a Gentile who stole it and put it here. So now, Lema Mishum de Savala de Rabbi Hanina must be held like Rabbi Hanina, because, right? Rove, we're going to say, just 1 second. Oh, sorry. I just got confused for a minute. Okay. I was confusing this with the next case. The issue is that the field was Orla. Sorry, I was missing the main point. The Chatzba de Chamra, they found it in someone's vineyard, which was Orla. What's Orla produce? Orla produce is the grapes there were from the first 3 years. Now, someone hid this barrel in here. We're going to assume that the barrel came from outside and not from inside this vineyard, right? If we assume proximity, we're going to say, what do you mean? The chances are there's a barrel in this vineyard hidden. It must be from this vineyard. That would be karov. And then it would all be forbidden because Orla fruits can't be eaten. But Ravina permitted it. Why did he permit it? Because he assumed it came from somewhere else. And in other words, why? Because we're going to go by rove. Most of the orchards in the area, most of the vineyards in the area are not Orla. So therefore, right, it's just, we assume, right? It's a major assumption. Most things aren't brand new. So we're going to assume it's fine. It's not forbidden. Lema, so then we would say it's because he holds like Rabbi Hanina, which is rove and karov. There's proximity, which is this vineyard, which is Orla, or the rest of them, which are not Orla. But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? It's obvious it doesn't come from this vineyard because of the way it was hidden there. It was hidden by a thief. Now, a thief is going to steal something from this vineyard and hide it in this vineyard? No, of course not. No one's going to hide a barrel of wine that they stole from this vineyard in the same vineyard. They're going to hide it somewhere else. Okay, again, why they're hiding this, I'm not sure, but they certainly wouldn't take your wine and hide it in your own vineyard if they stole it from you. To which the Gemara just points out this distinction that we're making, assuming, if it's hidden in this vineyard, they would never hide your wine. Why? Because you can identify your own wine. You'll know it's yours. And then you'll say, oh, this is my wine. Someone hid it here. It's really mine. But hanimile chamra, this is only wine. Aval inve mitzane, but if it's grapes, they would hide. So again, different explanations is why, but the one that seemed to make the most sense is that people don't necessarily recognize their own grapes. but they will recognize their own wine. People who make wine know how their wine tastes. They can tell the difference between their wine and other people's wines. So therefore, no one's going to hide wine they stole of the same person in that vineyard, but they might hide grapes, because if someone does come across the grapes, they won't necessarily realize that, they'll think maybe someone hid something in their yard. They won't necessarily think it's their own stuff. But if it's wine, they'll know it's theirs because they can identify it by the taste. Okay. In any case, this had nothing to do with our sugya. Hanu zike de chamre de ishchu be kofai. Big question what Beit Kofai is. Is it a city? Was it a majorly Jewish city? Was it something else, like someone's house? That was, we're talking about someone in particular. Anyway, what we have is, I can't think of the word, a node. It's, they would make flasks of wine. They found in Beit Kofai, okay, either a Jewish town or in a Jew's property. Shranu Rava, and Rava permitted this. So now we're going to say, Rabbi Chanina. He's going by proximity. It was found in a Jewish area. We'll assume it goes by the Jews, and not the fact that there's a lot of Gentiles out there that it could have come from. To which they say no. Shanehatan diruba de shafuchai, turning now to Amabet, Yisrael ninhu. What is shafuchai? Well, the Jews own the vineyards in this area, and they made the wine. And who are the Gentiles? The Gentiles were passerbys. So they were travelers. Now, travelers don't carry big barrels. Okay, that's for sure. But we're not talking about barrels. We're talking about flasks. But the flasks that we're talking about apparently were bigger flasks. We're going to see that in a minute. And the Jews generally, because they owned the vineyards and they made the wine, they would then pour the wine into them. And the question is, we're in this city, which is a Jewish city, where the Jews own the vineyards, and the Gentiles who come through are passing through. Now, the Gentiles could have dropped their flask, right? Very reasonable. So again, if we go by Rove, again, there's a lot of different people coming through, could have been Gentile. If we go by Karov, we're going to say it's for the Jew, who's, right, the main Jews are here. So they say, no, this has nothing to do with Rove and Karov, because it really has to do with who's more likely to have had wine in a flask. Now, we're going to say here that these flasks were the flasks used by the winemakers to sell to the people coming by. And they would fill up the wine into these flasks. And then it seems like the Gentiles would then take them and put them in smaller flasks and then use the smaller flasks, or maybe they would pour from there when they sold them from these smaller flasks into the even smaller ones, and the big flasks into the smaller ones. What they're basically saying is the users of these bigger flasks are the Jews, okay? Because they're the ones who pour the wine from the barrel into the node to sell them. And Hanimile B'Rav, here the Gemara says, we're talking about the big flasks. Aval Zutre, if they were small, Imar Me'ovred Rachim Nachim. Then, if they're the small ones, we're going to assume the majority of people who have the small ones are the Gentiles. So this all is really based on majority, because the majority of the big flasks are used by the Jews, and the majority of the small flasks are used by the Gentile passerbys. The Ika Rav Rabbe Bahadai, who, what if we find big and small ones together? Well, then, Imor Avrivare Havamanche. If we find big and small, we can assume they were all the Jews, because we assume when the Jews are carrying their wares to go sell them in the shuk, let's say, so they would put them on animals. And if they have, let's say, a big flask and a bit of a smaller one on the other side, in order to balance it, they would add another really small flask to keep it all balanced. So if you find big and small ones together, you can assume it comes from Jews. So this is more detective work, trying to figure out what's more likely rather than, and what's more expected in terms of the use of the big and the use of the small. And it's pretty clear, and it's not laws of Rove and Karov, Rove versus proximity. Okay, so again, we'll just really quickly review, even though we've done it a few times. We have three difficulties against Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina holds Rove and Karov when there's majority versus proximity. We're going to go by majority. We brought three sources that seem to say we go by proximity. We kind of explained them all to be able to match up to Rabbi Chanina. We went to Abai, who tried to bring a mission to prove it from the blood and coming from the uterus, which is the Rove, or maybe Rove Umatsoi, which Rava suggested can't prove from here because it's a bit of a different case. But then Rava himself changed his mind about it. It seems we have a proof. Then we went to a machloket between Rav and Shmuel that we thought was based on Rabbi Chanina and or not, and whether they hold like him or don't hold like him. But we rejected the comparison, as we did with two other cases where one ruled thinking we thought he ruled by Rove and not Karov. The second one we thought ruled by Karov and not Rove. And in the end, neither one really had anything to do with it because there were unique circumstances that led to the ruling, which didn't have to do with Rove versus Karov. New Mishnah. Okay, now we're moving to a topic that's going to be the next while of Mishnayot, of all sorts of things, and it's also what we talked about previously, of distancing things a certain amount from other things. So today we're going to talk about Marchikim et ha'ilan min ha'ir 25 amah, u'becharuv u'beshikma 50 amah. So we have trees. We can't have trees outside the city within the proximity of 25 cubits. If it's a carob tree or a sycamore tree, which apparently the branches are much bigger, then it has to be distanced even 50 cubits. Now, the issues could be many issues here. One is they thought it would take away from the beauty of the city, and that's what we're going to see in the Gemara. That's what Ula says. Takes away from the beauty of the city by having trees outside. Usually nowadays we plant trees to make it look nicer. They think that trees outside the city would actually take away from the beauty of the city. First of all, it blocks your view from the city, for sure. It blocks, it could, the roots could get in. By the way, I'm taking some of these from Mishnat Eretz Yisraeli as a good explanation. So it's really good for understanding Mishnayot. The roots could get in and ruin foundations of the city. It could attract birds. Okay? Anyone who has a bird problem, right, knows how bad it is when there's birds all around and they make a mess in your garden and they make noises and it's just annoying. So trees attract birds, and therefore you'll have a lot of more birds in the city if the trees are close to the city. The Yerushalmi says it's actually because it shades the city. It blocks the sun from getting into the city. So that's another problem. So there's all sorts of reasons as to why this could be. We'll see our Gemara brings one of them, which is basically Ula is going to say Mipnei Noyei Ha'ir. Says it's taking away from the beauty of the city, which could mean a bunch of different things, right? It could mean the light. It could mean the blocking the view. It could mean, the birds. We don't know. Okay, it could mean all sorts of things. So, but we do know one thing, which is bigger trees have to be distanced even more, which again could have to do with their roots, or it could have to do with their they're just more overbearing. Abba Shaul Omer, Kol ilan srak 50 amah. Abba Shaul does a little bit of a balance between benefit versus damage, right? Or damage versus benefit. If it's a fruit tree, well, then it's worth it. So, we'll allow that 25 cubits. But if it's not a fruit-bearing tree, which is useless to us, then we'll say keep it 50 cubits away. Because, you might want fruit trees, although they attract the birds. So, you have to balance that. So fruit trees are good, because at least you're getting fruits out of them, even if they're also attracting birds. Whereas non-fruit-bearing trees are really useless. I mean, they're not totally useless, but not enough that we're going to, it's the damage is more than the benefit. Now we get to what happens if it's there. Do we make you cut it down? So ima ir kadma, let's say I put up a tree. First the city was there, then I planted a tree, and we're assuming the tree is owned by an individual, and the city obviously is owned by the community. So we forced me to cut down my tree. I went against the law. Forced me to cut down my tree, and I obviously don't get compensated for it. V'imilan kadam, if first I had my tree there, and then you built a city, well, that's not my fault. So kotzetz v'noten dami. Okay, we cut down my tree because it's bothering the city, but we compensate me financially. Safek zeh kadam, safek zeh kadam. Okay, back to Baba Metzia. We don't know which one, so what do? I don't have proof. If we don't know which came first, right? Because it's years later, and now they say, what's your tree doing here? We're cutting it down. So do they have to pay me? No, because I don't have a way to prove it. So no notain dami. I have no way to prove that my tree was first. If I could, great. But if I can't prove it, I can't get money. So now, okay, this Mishnah seems like an obvious halacha, but we're going to actually have to compare this to a Mishnah that's coming up on tomorrow's daf, which is going to say something very different in a similar parallel case. So we're going to get to that soon. So my time, I already told you this. What's the reason for this halacha? Amar ula mishum noyei ha'ir, for the beauty of the city. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? There should be another reason. Now, by the way, many commentaries think that this beauty of the city is only a city in Israel. Now, cities in Israel, they learn from the Torah where it talks about the areas the Levites settled in. They talk there about a field, and we talked about this in Eruvin a lot. There's a field. There's a city. Outside the city, there's something called a migrash. The first 1,000 cubits are called a migrash. You're not supposed to plant there. The next 1,000 cubits are for the fields. Okay, and then it's already the 2,000 cubits that are outside the city, right? That's the end of the tchum, because all that is still considered part of the city. So, the environs of the city, and then the fields. Fields are always outside the city, but with a distance of 1,000 cubits. So they say, forget about the fact that the numbers don't match up. But the reason to distance the trees should be because it's a migrash, and you're not allowed to make a migrash into a field. And you can't, just like you can't make a field into a migrash, can't do either. So enosim sadeh migrash v'lo migrash sadeh. This is designated space. It's supposed to be empty outside the city. And for 1,000 cubits, forget about 50 cubits, right? I'm sorry, 25 cubits or 50 cubits, it's 1,000 cubits. So why didn't the Mishnah say that? And why didn't it use that number, right? Why did it use such a smaller number? So they say, maybe our Mishnah, lo tzricha le Rabbi Elazar. Well, the Torah said 1,000 cubits this are a migrash, and then the next 1,000 cubits are fields. But it doesn't mean you can't plant in first 1,000 cubits. It's just designating. That's the way they did their cities, but it doesn't mean you can't plant it. And so even though you can theoretically plant, just don't do it within 25 or 50 cubits because of the city beauty. And even the Rabbanan Nami, we'll explain our Mishnah even according to the rabbis. And they say you can't. We're going to distinguish between planting fields, which are usually grains and things like that, and not trees. Trees are not a problem to put in the migrash. But don't put them too close to the city because it'll affect the city, the beauty of the city. So now we want to know, where'd you get this distinction between seeds and planting fields and trees? How do we know this? Ditanya. They're going to bring an issue of Masechet Shabbat. Ditanya. Okay, it's an Eruvin, actually. It's related to Shabbat issues. Eruvin is all about Shabbat issues. Karpaf yoter mi beitz atayim shukaf l'dira. You might remember these things and not remember what they are. I'll explain to you. So a karpaf is a big space that's bigger than a usual private domain, but it's got a wall and it's surrounded for the purposes of living in. If it's surrounded for the purposes of living in, it becomes a private domain. If it's not surrounded, if it's got a wall, but it's not meant for living, then, and it's a beit sa'atayim, which means enough that you could plant a field that could yield produce of more than 2 se'ah of crops, then we treat it like what's called a karmelit. It's more like a Reshut Rabim, okay? So Reshut Rabim on a D'Rabbanan level, you can't carry 4 cubits within it. Okay? It's considered more like a public domain. So if you have this karpaf more than Beit Satan, which was surrounded for the purposes of living in, but then you planted it. Okay, we always think of a karpaf as like a football field. Okay, it's like something like that. Okay, but you planted in it. Now that shows you're not planning to live in it if you planted it. So as soon as you plant the majority of it, hareu kikinav asur, it already becomes a karmelit. It's like a garden and it's forbidden. But nitaru bo hareu kechatzer mutar. If you plant trees in the majority of it, we still consider that living space because people often in their own living space have trees. So that doesn't cancel it out from being living space. And here you see this distinction between planting a field and planting a field of crops and planting a field of trees. Now we get to the second part of the Mishnah, which came first and what are the rules for each. So if the city was there first and then you planted your tree, you cut it and you don't get compensated. Now by a bore, if I plant a tree near your well, okay, near your pit, which my roots will get there and possibly ruin the walls of your bore. Well, there, what does it say? You can insist I cut down my tree, but you actually have to compensate me even if I planted my tree after. And here, right, there it's actually more strange. Why am I getting compensated for it? But here, I don't get compensated. I'm a Rav Kahana. This is something similar to what we saw in a different sugya, which is the k'terah that's owned by a lot of people. A pot will be not hot and not cold because no one's going to deal with it. Everyone's going to think someone else is going to deal with it, and therefore it's always going to stay, right? So what's the issue? The issue is, since that was a private, so we can make you pay me before we chop down my tree. But in this case, if we wait till you pay me, no one's ever going to pay me. This one's going to say, oh, you pay her. You pay her, you pay her, you pay her. No one's going to pay me, and the tree's never going to get cut down. Umay kushya, the Gemara says, what are you talking about? That's not a difficulty. Dilma, shane hazeka de rabim, hazeka de yachid. There's a much simpler answer. When you cause damage to the public, we're not going to compensate you for it. When you cause damage to an individual, So the individual will compensate you for it, but it's not like causing damage to the public. To the public, you're certainly not going to compensate you. You did something majorly wrong by causing damage to so many people. So therefore, now we heard Rav Kana said this about something related. He must have said it on a different part, which is, now notice what happens here. If the tree came first, we cut it down. Okay, now my tree came first, then you built your city. So we cut down my tree and then we pay me money. Notice the order. We don't say, I'll wait till I get my money and then I'll cut down the tree. No, I have to cut down the tree and I'll get my money later. Why can't I say to you, wait, listen, the city inhabitants, I'm not cutting down my tree till I get my money, which is usually what we would do, right? Then he says, no, we don't do that because it'll never happen. In other words, yes, I'll have a private problem that I'll have trouble collecting my money, but that's not what's the issue here. The issue is we want the tree cut down so it doesn't affect the city. If we wait till that somebody pays me, it'll take forever and it'll ruin the city for all that time. Now, again, we're going to have a difference here. If we're not sure which one, we cut down the tree, to which the Gemara says, if it's a suffix in a bor case, we don't cut it down. With the bor, it's very simple. If the tree came first, we cut down the tree. If the bor came first, we cut down the tree. If the tree came first, we don't cut down the tree. If it's a suffix, we also don't cut it down. Here, if it's a suffix, we do cut it down. Well, the answer is very simple. Because hatam divad elav lemekatzkai sfeko nami lo amrin lekotz. There, if it's for sure that I was first, we don't have to cut it down at all. Here, even if I was first, we have to cut down the tree. So therefore, of course, if it's a suffix, right? Hacha divad lemekatzkai. Here, we're for sure going to cut it down. So sfeko nami amrin lekotz. So of course, we're going to cut it down. What's the difference though if it's suffix? The money issue. Imishum dame amrin le'aiteraya ushkol. But I won't get my money if it's a suffix because I won't be able to prove it. Okay, but for sure we're going to cut it because in all the possibilities, we're going to cut my tree. New Mishnah. Now we're worried about a threshing floor. What's the issue with a threshing floor? They do the winnowing there, and right, they trample on the grains, and then the wheat separates from the chaff, and then the chaff blows away. Now there's two ways it could blow away. One is just the wind comes and blows it because what happens. Another is you use a winnowing fork, which is this huge pitchfork. They would throw it up in the air and everything would blow. Now you can imagine what's going to happen. That chaff is very light. It blows in all directions. And it could ruin things, which we'll talk about very shortly. So therefore, machigim goren kavua. If I'm building a permanent threshing floor, we have to separate it from the city. Chamishim ama, again, the 50 cubits. And lo yaseh adam goren kavua b'toch shelo, also in my own field, I can't do it. Let's say it's not near the city, but it's near other people's fields. I have to distance it from everyone else's fields 50 cubits also. And if my friend has things planted there, my neighbor, or a plowed field, I have to distance it so that it won't cause damage. Now, this sounds like a new amount. This is an unclear amount, just as much as it won't cause damage to their crops. So something doesn't really jive here. Why in the beginning was it 50, as if that's what's going to damage. And then the second one gives this different number, which is really not a number, is until it doesn't cause damage. So Amar Abaye, Seifa Atan Legoren She'eno Kavua. Abaye says the beginning started off with this permanent one. And this was talking about the non-permanent one. A non-permanent one, just as much as it won't cause damage, doesn't have to be necessarily 50 cubits, it could be less. Now we just want to define what he means. What does it mean, not kavua? If you don't use the pitchfork, because remember, if you use a pitchfork, what's going to happen? You're going to lift it up in the air and it's going to blow farther. If one that's not kavua is you just trample on it and then, right, we have your animals trample on it and then it blows, but it blows from the ground. It's not going to blow as far. And that's the one that we're going to say is less permanent. And that one we're going to do just bichdei shelo yazik. Rav Ashi Amar, he has a totally different interpretation of the Mishnah. He doesn't even think there's a question because he says, Matan Kamar. It's not a different measurement. It's just explaining the whole Mishnah. My time, Amrachik and Goren Kavuamin at your Chamishim Amar. Why do you have to distance it 50 cubits? Kadesha lo yazik. The Kadesha lo yazik is explaining the whole Mishnah. You have to distance these things from other people's stuff so that it doesn't damage. That's the whole reason for the Mishnah, but the number, the amount is 50 cubits, and there's no difference. To which they bring a difficulty on Abaye now from a source, Meitive. Marchikim Goren Kavuamin at your Chamishim Amar. Ukashem shemarchikim at your Chamishim Amar. כך מרחיקים מדלואיו ומקישואיו ומנטיותיו ומנירו של חברו 50 אמה כדי שלא יזיק. This Braita says exactly what Rav Ashi just explained in the Mishnah. We have to distance it from a city. We have to distance it from our friend's yard. We have to distance it, from their fields. We have to distance it from all their things that are growing and plowing 50 cubits so that it doesn't damage. Exactly the way Rav Ashi read it. Bishlam ala Rav Ashi nicha. This makes sense for Rav Ashi. Ela Abaye kasha, but it doesn't make any sense according to Abaye. And in fact, kasha. This is in fact difficult because it doesn't seem to have two different measurements. Last part for today. We understand when it comes to the kishuim and the deluim, which are the cucumbers and the gourds, because what will happen, the chaff will blow, get into the center of the flour and ruin it, and it won't be able to grow properly. But what's the problem with a plowed field? Right, either one of them said it. We're not sure who. Because it turns into fertilizer, which actually sounds like a good thing. But Rashi says it's too much. You'll end up with too much fertilizer inside. And basically, after you plow, you put the seeds in, and it's going to ruin the seeds that go in there because it's going to be over-fertilized. It's going to burn them. Okay, so the second part of today's daf, we basically had the issue with the tree and the city, which we compared a lot to the tree and an individual's pit, and why there are differences. And then we talked about distancing your threshing floor and for what reason and at what distance. And there were two different opinions about how to understand the Mishnah. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and we should have B'sorot Tovot.